In 2009, Swedish archaeologists made a discovery that rewrote history. While examining Viking burial sites, they found something that shouldn't exist: Arabic inscriptions woven into the funeral clothes of a 10th century Norse woman. Not just any Arabic, the words spelled out Allah and Ali, but here's what makes this discovery absolutely stunning. This wasn't some random accident or modern contamination. These silver-threaded inscriptions were deliberate, intricate, and found in a grave hundreds of miles from the nearest Islamic territory. How did Islamic calligraphy end up in a Viking grave in Sweden? And why would Norse warriors, infamous for raiding Christian monasteries, be buried with Islamic artifacts? The answer reveals a secret chapter of history that most people have never heard. A chapter involving rivers of silver, warriors turned merchants, and a trade network that stretched from Scandinavia to Baghdad. This is the story of how Vikings and Muslims became unlikely partners in one of history's most profitable and surprising business relationships. Before we dive into how this happened, we need to understand what the Vikings actually wanted. And it wasn't what you think. Pop culture has trained us to imagine Vikings as raiders and pillagers, and yes, they absolutely did that. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 CE terrified Christian Europe for good reason. But here's what the History Channel won't tell you. Raiding was actually the side hustle. The main business? Trading. Think about it logically. You can only raid a monastery once, maybe twice if you're patient, but trade? Trade is renewable. Trade builds wealth over generations. And the Vikings understood this better than almost anyone in medieval Europe. By the 9th century, Scandinavian traders had established routes that would make modern logistics companies jealous. They had mastered river navigation in ways that gave them access to places no other European culture could easily reach. Their shallow draft longships, the same vessels used for raiding, could navigate rivers that Mediterranean ships couldn't dream of entering. And this is where the Islamic world enters the picture. While Western Europe was fragmented into small kingdoms, still recovering from Rome's collapse, the Islamic Caliphate was experiencing a golden age. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, controlled territories stretching from Spain to Central Asia. But more importantly, they controlled something the Vikings desperately wanted: silver. Not just any silver. We're talking about massive quantities of dirham coins, minted from silver mines in places like Afghanistan and Central Asia. These coins have been found in hoards across Scandinavia. Over 80,000 Islamic coins discovered in Sweden alone. To put that in perspective, more Islamic coins from this period have been found in Scandinavia than in most Islamic territories themselves. But why did Vikings want Islamic silver so badly? And what could they possibly offer in return that the sophisticated Islamic world would want? The answer lies in a network of rivers that most people have never heard of. The Volga River became the Vikings' highway to wealth. Starting from the Baltic Sea, Norse traders, who the Slavs called Rus, which eventually gave Russia its name, would navigate through a complex system of rivers and portages, dragging their ships overland when necessary until they reached the Caspian Sea. At the end of this grueling journey, they'd arrive at trading posts like Bulgar, the capital of the Volga-Bulgaria state. And this is where things get interesting. Arab chroniclers from the period actually wrote about meeting these Norse traders. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat, traveled to Volga, Bulgaria in 921 and left us detailed descriptions. His accounts are fascinating and sometimes disturbing. He describes the Vikings as tall, fair-skinned traders covered in tattoos from fingertip to neck. He documented their business practices, their hygiene habits, which he found appalling, and most importantly, what they were selling: furs, amber, honey, weapons, walrus, ivory, and slaves. Let's pause on that last one because it's crucial to understanding this trade relationship. The Vikings were supplying the Islamic world with enslaved people captured from their raids and wars across Eastern Europe. This was a massive part of their trade economy, and it's a dark reality that can't be glossed over. The Arabic word for slave, sakaliba, literally derives from Slav, because so many enslaved people came from Slavic territories via Viking traders. But the Vikings weren't just selling, they were buying. Islamic silver was the obvious prize, but they were also purchasing silk from China, spices from India, and glassware from Syria. Archaeologists have found glass beads from the Islamic world in Viking graves across Scandinavia, alongside Persian textiles and even pieces of Buddha statues from Central Asia. The Vikings had essentially become middlemen in a trade network connecting 3 continents. Now, here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. These weren't just quick transactions where Vikings showed up, dumped their goods, grabbed some silver, and left. No, many Vikings actually lived in Islamic territories for extended periods. Some learned Arabic, some converted to Islam, and the evidence suggests that cultural exchange went both ways in ways historians are still discovering. Remember those Arabic inscriptions on Viking burial clothes from the beginning? Researchers at Uppsala University spent years analyzing them using advanced imaging technology. What they found was remarkable. The geometric patterns weren't just decorative, they contained Kufic script, an early form of Arabic calligraphy woven woven with silver and silk thread. The level of craftsmanship suggests these weren't cheap souvenirs. They were expensive, prestigious items. But it gets weirder. In 2015, researchers discovered a Viking ring in a Swedish grave that contained an inscription reading, "For Allah." The ring dated to the 9th century and contained a violet gemstone. For decades, it sat in a museum mice identified as having a Christian inscription. Only when new analysis techniques were applied did the Islamic connection become clear. These weren't random trinkets. The placement in burial sites suggests these items held significant meaning to the Vikings who owned them. And then there's the question of influence. Did this extensive contact change Viking culture? The evidence suggests yes, but in subtle ways. Some Viking ship designs show modifications that likely came from observing Islamic naval technology. Certain decorative motifs in Scandinavian metalwork from this period show striking similarities to Islamic geometric patterns. More provocatively, some historians have argued that the Vikings' eventual transition from raiding to trading, from paganism to Christianity, was partly influenced by observing the sophisticated, wealthy, organized societies of the Islamic world. When you see firsthand how profitable stable trade relationships can be, pillaging starts to look less appealing. But this relationship wasn't all peaceful commerce and cultural exchange. There was tension, conflict, and competition baked into every transaction. The Volga trade route was dangerous. Vikings faced raids from competing groups, harsh weather, and the constant risk of disease. The journey from Scandinavia to the Caspian could take months, and there was no guarantee you'd survive it. Ibn Fadlan's account describes Viking funeral rituals he witnessed, including human sacrifice, that showed just how high the stakes were. These traders knew many wouldn't return home, and the Islamic world wasn't passively accepting Viking goods either. Muslim merchants were shrewd negotiators who understood value and leverage. They controlled access to the silver mines, they set the prices. If Vikings wanted access to those dirhams, they played by Islamic rules. There's also evidence of military conflicts. The Rus Vikings eventually established the state of Kievan Rus, which would sometimes clash with Islamic powers. In 913, a Viking force actually attacked territories along the Caspian Sea, raiding Islamic settlements. The response was brutal. Local Muslim forces annihilated the Viking raiders. This wasn't a one-sided relationship of mutual respect. It was complex, often tense, and occasionally violent. Yet despite these conflicts, the trade continued. Why? Because both sides needed what the other had. The Islamic world needed the raw materials from the north: furs for cold climates, amber for luxury goods, slaves for labor, and unique products like walrus ivory that couldn't be sourced elsewhere. The Vikings needed Islamic silver because it was the most stable currency available and could be used throughout their entire trading network, from Dublin to Constantinople. This mutual dependency created a relationship that persisted for over 2 centuries, surviving wars, religious differences, and cultural misunderstandings. And then, almost overnight, it ended. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the flow of Islamic silver into Scandinavia slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. Hoards dated after 1015 contain almost no Islamic dirhams. What happened? The answer involves economics, politics, and the exhaustion of silver mines in Central Asia. As the Abbasid Caliphate fragmented into smaller states, the centralized control over silver production broke down. The mines that had fueled the dirham production began to run dry. Without new silver entering the system, there was nothing to trade. Simultaneously, Vikings were finding new opportunities elsewhere. Western Europe was becoming wealthier and more organized. The establishment of Christian kingdoms in Scandinavia redirected trade toward European markets. German silver from the Harz Mountains began replacing Islamic dirhams in Viking economies. The Rus Vikings, meanwhile, were transforming into something new. They weren't just traders passing through anymore. They were settling, intermarrying with Slavic peoples, adopting Orthodox Christianity, and building what would become the foundation of Russian and Ukrainian states. By the time the silver dried up, many of their descendants had already moved on, but the legacy remained. Those 80,000 coins buried in Swedish soil, the Arabic inscriptions woven into funeral clothes, the genetic evidence showing a Middle Eastern ancestry in some Scandinavian populations, the Arabic words that entered Norse language, all proof of a connection that shaped both cultures in ways that ripple forward to today. So what does this forgotten chapter of history actually teach us? First, it demolishes simplistic narratives. Vikings weren't just raiders. Muslims weren't isolated in the Middle East. Medieval Europe wasn't closed off from global trade. The world of 1,000 years ago was more connected, more complex, and more cosmopolitan than most people imagine. Second, It shows how economics can bridge seemingly unbridgeable cultural divides. Vikings and Muslims had almost nothing in common religiously or culturally. They came from opposite ends of the known world, yet mutual profit created relationships that lasted centuries and changed both societies. And third, it reveals how much of history we've simply forgotten or never learned. For decades, those Arabic inscriptions sat in museums unidentified. Those Islamic coins were treated as curiosities rather than evidence of a massive trade network. The story was always there, buried in the ground, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. The Viking woman buried with Allah woven into her funeral clothes represents something profound. A moment when two worlds touched, traded, and influenced each other in ways that neither probably fully understood. She might have been a trader herself, or the wife of a merchant who traveled the Volga. Maybe she converted to Islam. Maybe she simply valued beautiful, expensive fabric. We'll never know her story, but we know this. 1,000 years before globalization, before the internet, before even the printing press, people found ways to connect across vast distances. They learned each other's languages, traded goods and ideas, and built relationships that defied the boundaries of religion and culture. The Arabic inscriptions and Swedish graves aren't just archaeological curiosities. They're proof that the human drive to connect, to trade, to understand each other has always been stronger than the forces trying to keep us apart. And that's a lesson worth remembering.